So my final messages today are obviously encouraging people to continue to listen to the Bureau of Meteorology warnings and also the emergency services warnings, particularly those put out by the SES as the combat agency for storm, flood and tsunami. This weather event is tracking south, as we know, and that will impact different communities along the East Coast in different ways. And finally, when it comes to donations, I really want to say thank you to the people of New South Wales and right across Australia and indeed the globe who have dug deep so far to donate to these communities that have been so terribly hit by this natural disaster over the last few weeks. But I'd really appreciate it if people could use the official channels in order to donate, because this ensures that we get the right help to the right people at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and good morning, everyone. And while the rain has eased, moderate to major flooding continues for many rivers across the northern rivers down into the mid-north coast. We still have major flooding on numerous rivers across the north. That includes the Wilsons, the Richmond, the Clarence and also the Orara River. And we have moderate flood warnings continue on the Hastings, Nambucca and also further south towards the Macleay, Ballinger and Kalang rivers. So even though in some communities the sun is coming out this morning, there is still major flooding ongoing through numerous rivers. And as you heard earlier, while the peak around the Lismore was late yesterday at 11.4, we are still experiencing major flooding through that community and further communities downstream as well. And I'll touch on that now. So Lismore, as we said, has peaked earlier, but major flooding is continuing this morning. And later today, we should see the water start falling below the levee, which will stop the inundation, at least in the CBD, but of course still many homes around the Lismore area, both in North and South Lismore, will continue to experience flooding today. Further downstream, as we move into the Richmond and Wilsons River, Corokai is experiencing major flooding right now, likely to peak during the day and then slowly ease into tonight. And further downstream at Woodburn as well. We could also experiencing major flooding there later this morning into this afternoon. Now on the Clarence River, we're seeing the peak around the Grafton area as we speak right now at major flood levels through the community of Grafton, and communities and towns further south of Grafton downstream of the Clarence River will need to be prepared for moderate to major flooding as the water makes its way downstream of the Clarence River. Moving further south as well, we do have numerous moderate flood warnings around the Coffs Harbour area, with, as I mentioned, Hastings, Nambucca also experiencing minor to moderate flooding. And we did see 50 to 150 millimetres around there yesterday and overnight, but thankfully the rain has eased. We're seeing the showers continue into the Hunter area and lower parts of the mid-north coast, but we're not expecting heavy or torrential rainfall, just a continuation of these showers coming in. So while that's good news, the rain has eased, there's still a lot of water to move through the rivers, catchments and streams, particularly in the northern rivers and also the mid-north coast. So communities that live on or near, particularly the Wilsons, Richmond, Clarence and Orara rivers, particularly downstream where the flood peaks are occurring, you still need to stay up to date with the latest forecast and warnings as that water continues to move downstream and could lead to inundation of homes, properties, businesses and farmland, particularly near and adjacent to any rivers, creeks and streams. Now, as this low has moved offshore, the rain threat has eased, but now we're transitioning into a wind and damaging surf threat. So a severe weather warning is current from Kempsey all the way down to the Victorian border, and that's for many of our coastal communities. And that is for abnormally high tides and damaging surf. As the low deepens offshore, we're going to see the winds increase along the coastal communities for today and tomorrow with strong and gusty winds. And the possibility of the odd tree down as well with these winds. The soils are already saturated, making it easier for trees to come down. But the main concern will be abnormally high tides and also coastal erosion as these large seas and swell, particularly for our south-facing beaches, are likely to bring coastal erosion and also inundation of low-lying areas, particularly for property difficulties right on the beach as we get a combination of high tide and these large waves, particularly on the high tide. So for communities from the Victorian border all the way up to Kempsey, especially those right on the coast, we'll need to, particularly around the high tide, just stay up to date with the warnings and just be aware of your surroundings and watch out for low-lying inundation, particularly right at the beach, and also stay away from the beach because we're likely to see hazardous and dangerous surf conditions and possible coastal erosion, particularly for south-facing beaches. So as this weather event continues, transition from the flooding event will continue in the north. The rain has eased, but we'll still see coastal showers today and tomorrow, and we'll see some gusty winds, particularly around the coast. The threat now from Kempsey all the way down to the Victorian border for our coastal communities remains abnormally high tides, particularly on the high tide, where it could see tides approach the highest astronomical tide of the year, and also damaging and hazardous surf likely to lead to coastal erosion on our south, particularly on our south-facing beaches, and that's for today and tomorrow. So remember, as always, and as we keep saying, stay up to date with the latest forecasts and warnings via our website, app and social media, and for our flood-affected communities, continue to always listen to all advice from emergency services. And now with that, I'll hand you over to the Deputy Commissioner.
Thank you, Dean, and good morning, everybody. The New South Wales State Emergency Service, together with its partner agencies, including the Australian Defence Force and Interstate Resources, continues to respond to significant riverine and flash flooding events across both the northern rivers and the mid-north coast. As you've heard, some of the rainfall totals have eased overnight. However, there is still significant riverine flooding to come, and significant amount of water is already on the ground, and that water needs to discharge through these systems. So the riverine threat is certainly not over at this point in time. There are a number of days to come before these waters come back to usual levels within the rivers, so people need to remain vigilant, particularly those communities and those people that interact with these river systems on a daily basis. Over the last 24 hours, the New South Wales SES has responded to just over 100 requests for assistance and 11 flood rescues in that time. Most of those flood rescues were during the day yesterday, as communities were caught with some rapid rising flash flooding in a number of communities across the mid-north coast. As you've heard, 20 evacuation orders remain in place across New South Wales, and 11 evacuation warnings are also in place currently. That will change, and I once again urge the community to stay across the warnings and the updates that come from both the New South Wales SES and the Bureau of Meteorology, but also to stay aware of their surroundings, to know what your current situation is and what is happening around you. You need to be aware of your situation at all times. As I said before, there is significant water that is still required to move through the river systems, and whilst we have seen the peak at Lismore overnight and early this morning, that water needs to discharge down through past Corrockeye, Broadwater, and eventually out to the ocean. That will take time, and those risks remain for those communities at this point in time. Can I also address some comments that I've seen recently in regards to the lifting of the evacuation order in Lismore again yesterday? The evacuation order that was issued for the CBD of Lismore was issued in relation to the riverine flooding that was likely to occur on the Wilsons River, which was likely to lead to the overtopping of the levee. That risk failed to eventuate, and as the day went on, the river system came back and lowered. As a result, that risk no longer being present, we decided in consultation with a number of people, including people locally, to remove the evacuation order and allow people to return to try and get on with the recovery effort. That risk that was presented by the Wilsons River rising was no longer there. As you heard, it took until yesterday morning before the levee actually overtopped due to the severe weather and the exceptional new rainfall that was not predicted at that point in time. As I said yesterday, we do not have the joy of hindsight when predicting whether or not to lift those warnings. And at that point in time, it is still my belief that that call was the right call to make. I also know there are many infrastructure challenges across particularly the northern rivers, and that in itself, we see many businesses, homes, and including some of the emergency services complexes that are still in a state of repair, and will continue to work on those. There is numerous power outages, over 6,000 properties across the northern rivers remain without power to this time, and some of those include our own facilities as well. We will continue to work as quickly as we can to restore those, but I am confident that those issues have not hampered our response during this particular time. Thank you very much for hearing questions.
Can I ask, the flood didn't reach the 12 metre level that was predicted. What was the exact reason that it didn't reach that level?
Do you want to talk to that, mate?
Yeah, thanks. So we saw at 11.4, and in our warnings yesterday afternoon, we were talking about a flood peak reaching or near the 12 metre mark. Now, we're expecting a little bit further rainfall, and it didn't quite occur. And there's also a lot of streams and creeks that you need to observe to come in that. And we're constantly rerunning our model data with that. So it's definitely more of a good news that it was only 11.4 and not the near 12 metre mark. But in saying that, that is almost still a metre over levy, and it still had devastating consequences for many residents in the town of Lismore.
How difficult is it to predict these kind of weather systems, like the ones affecting Lismore?
Yeah, as I mentioned yesterday as well, these coastal troughs and very small-scale low-pressure systems are very dynamic and highly evolving situations. They rapidly change, they rapidly deepen, and they rapidly move. And at the Bureau, we use 5 of the best models in the world, and we're constantly being updated by that model data and using that. And that continues to feed in all the observations, satellite data, everything that we use. And together it spits out a forecast and produces a forecast. And when that does change and the situation does change, we then obviously rapidly escalate that as well, as we did on the night that the situation occurred, I should say, through Lismore, obviously upping the escalation to major flooding, and where we saw the overtopping early the next morning.
Just for the Acting Commissioner. So you explained yesterday and again this morning that a lot of the issues are because of infrastructure damages from the past floods. Do you think that the SES has enough funding from the government to be able to fix these issues?
Look, the SES has received significant upgrades in its budget in the last few years around particularly fleet. However, as we've said before, no organisation is ever going to say no to receiving more funding and more money to do more things for more people.
Should it be a priority going forward?
I think that's a question for the Minister.
Minister, do you think that should be a priority?
Absolutely. It's my job as Minister to fight tooth and nail for all of the resourcing and the funding to accompany that. Our emergency services organisations across the board do a wonderful job at keeping our communities safe. They're very, very dedicated to that, and I'll be continuing to take up the fight to ensure that they are properly resourced and funded.
Have you spoken to the Premier and the Treasurer about that recently?
These are ongoing discussions within government, and of course we, as we all know, we have an independent inquiry that's looking at the flooding that has occurred, particularly across the Northern Rivers region, but it will look at other parts of the state as well. And I'm very much looking forward to, seeing how that inquiry unfolds and any recommendations that they put forward.
Now, obviously, the Acting Commissioner has explained why some of these issues happen, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of people in Lismore are quite angry and upset about the evacuation confusion yesterday. Do you apologise to people for what happened? The Commissioner has explained why, but it still caused them a lot of grief after having endured that a month ago. Do you apologise to them?
There's no doubt that the communities of Lismore and the Northern Rivers region have taken an absolute battering over the last 5 weeks. There's a lot of people, for very, very good reason, are very upset at the moment. A lot of people are still displaced. They really want to get back into their homes as quickly as possible, and they want life to return to what it was on, the 26th or the 27th even of February. The emergency services organisations are doing the best job that they can with the information that they receive at that point in time. And again, I very much welcome the inquiry. They have wide-reaching terms of reference. I'm encouraging everyone in the community that has been impacted by this weather event to put in a submission to that inquiry, and as it hopefully will travel around New South Wales, to go and talk to Professor O'Kane and Mr Fuller about their experiences and how they believe we can all work together more closely to help protect our communities into the future and do it better. And there's a role for the community, absolutely, in that. There's a role for local, state and federal governments and our emergency services organisations, and looking very forward to, to really understanding what more we can do, how we can do things better, whether that's systems and processes, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's funding. All of these things, I believe, will receive their due attention through this inquiry process.
And there's only about 464 flood relief grants of the 8,534 applications that have been paid so far. When will you get that?
Oh, well, we are throwing all the resources we possibly can at that at the moment, and we absolutely determined, whether you're a small business or whether you're an individual or a family that's been impacted at this time, to make sure that we get that support to you as quickly as we possibly can. There's a lot of people and businesses, I'm sure we can appreciate, who have absolutely lost everything, including the very basics of identification and being able to, really articulate what damage has occurred to them. So our agencies are working very well together collectively to make sure that that we really help people as quickly as we can, make it as simple as possible so people can access that support, and we will continue to do that.
How many grant assessors are in Lismore right now for the flood grants?
I'd have to take that offline, but more than happy to come back to you with that number.
Is there an update on the missing woman and what's being done to locate her?
The lady in question is still missing, and police are leading that search to find her.